I get it. We need to tell people to do difficult things, do hard things, learn how to suffer and tolerate. If you think you're going to be that challenge person, then at the right time, in the right moment, burn the boats. If you think this is going to push you to play out of a place of extreme fear, or you think this is going to push those you lead out of extreme fear, then don't burn the boats, man. Give them an out.
What factors do you think contribute to the toughness of Ukrainians as they fight off the Russians?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, and one that I haven't been asked, but highly relevant. I think there's something that is really important here when we look at the Ukrainians is that is they have this authentic sense of like mission and belonging and connection that I think is just invaluable, that almost like frees them up. So we have actually all sorts of research that shows us that going through anything difficult, if we have a purpose that is greater than ourselves, it's almost like it takes the reins off and our brain and body go, well, yeah, this kind of sucks, but this mission, this purpose is so important that we're going to let you push further than normal. And I think that's what you see in the sense of the Ukrainians. And then I think the other thing that is really important here is that if you look at their leadership and Zelensky and others, they are on the ground with them. And from the get-go, it's been this kind of, I'm in this fight together. And although we all have different jobs, I'm not retreating. I'm not going to safe space. I'm not getting out of the country early on. Like, I believe in this, and I'm going to go through this danger with you guys. And again, I think that sends this wonderful message of belonging and connection that almost makes it where they have this kind of superpower where it's like, okay, like this is so important to us as people, us, broader out as a country or, whatever you want to call it. And I think that just leads you to, handling things, fighting better, all of that, because of being more gritty and resilient and tough or what have you, than if you're simply told, hey, go fight these people without any reason or why behind it.
And this counterexample of just telling people to go fight, what have you learned about that sort of push from top-down leaders in terms of building toughness?
Yeah, absolutely. So it often backfires. So what we often think is we think like, oh, if I am kind of this authoritarian dictator to essentially push these people to fight, like that's going to create this discipline and resilience and toughness and have you. But it backfires for a simple reason, is that we know that people are tougher when they have some sort of intrinsic motivation. And we just talked about that why with the Ukrainians, but some intrinsic motivation where this isn't, just to earn some money or to do this job, but it has actual meaning and purpose behind it. And we often get in our way when we look at that authoritarian style, because when we use control, when we dictate and demand, when we, in the workplace, micromanage people, what happens is we take away that intrinsic motivation. We take away that sense of control, that sense of, I can, have an impact here. And when you do that, like people naturally default to kind of apathy or like, what's the point or why care? And they just end up going through their motions or doing the bare minimum of the job asked just to, keep their job or, to look okay and not get in trouble.
Mm-hmm. What about cultures that historically are shown to have some success on this sort of push or this hyper toughness, aggressive kind of style? I'm thinking of the Spartans, and it seemed to be, from what I read, a shame culture where even the women would mock the men if they were cowardly. What role does something like that have?
Yeah, so I think absolutely. So one thing that I want to get clear here is there's nuance in all of this. So there's the way I look at it is there's different motivational levers we can pull. And what overwhelming research tells us is that in general, it's best to pull we'll just call them the kind of positive growth side of those levers. But every once in a while, there's like a benefit to pulling we'll say the opposite extreme, the negative lever. And often that is to kind of shock people out of kind of the rut or the rut of competency they've gotten in, right? And it almost makes them where they reevaluate stuff. Now, when you look at cultures in particular, like you mentioned the Spartans there that use like shame and all those things, I think, again, this is where context really matters. And I'm going to give you the more modern example of, let's say, the 1940s, 50s military or sport or football style that had a lot of success in those eras where essentially, to use the sporting example, it was the coach's way or the highway. And if you didn't, do the crazy things, then like you were kicked off the team. And when I talk to people who, grew up in this era, they pretty much told me, well, it was pretty simple. Is I was either on the football team or I went back home, and the option at home was working in the fields. So I was going to stay no matter what. And I think what we've seen in modern society, even in that, 70 years since then, since the 1950s, and even more so comparing to older societies like Spartan and all that stuff, is because of the going from local, what I'll call more of a local tribal world, where it's you need to get your identity, your sense of status, etc., from your community. Now we have a global world where essentially we're always in comparison and judgment mode, and we always have an inordinate amount of options and choices, which we didn't have back then. So that changes the dynamic a little bit, where that maybe authoritarian style like can work, especially when the world is small, but often fails when the world has so many options and opportunities, where athletes or individuals will say, okay, I can't get my sense of status or my role in this society based on, I'm going to go find it somewhere else. I'm going to go do the other thing that doesn't, require being shamed or punished or what have you, where I still get that fulfillment of status or some sorts of role identity around it.
So you're saying then that nowadays in this globalized society that it's the internal sense of meaning or connection to a bigger purpose that seems to be the more effective driver given the culture.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. As we've moved into a world that is kind of global and all that stuff, is the way I kind of look at it is we have these basic psychological needs that need to be filled, right? We need to feel like we belong in wherever we are. We need to feel like we can make progress in whatever we're doing. And we need to feel like we can have an impact, like we have some sort of autonomy. And the cultures change throughout history. The cultures change between Eastern and Western, to use a broad brush, right? In Western societies, we often try and fulfill those needs through a more individualistic kind of ideal. In Eastern societies, we often try and fulfill some of those needs through a more kind of connected or community instead of a self kind of ideal. So how we fulfill those needs shifts and changes based on the cultural context we're in. But I think as we've kind of moved to, again, a world that is more global, connected, etc., it kind of pushes us towards like fulfilling these needs in a different way. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing, where that kind of intrinsic mode is probably even more important now than ever.
So does that make us also more susceptible to manipulation and things? I'm thinking, I think there are a lot of Russian soldiers who believe that they are defending Ukraine from Nazi influences.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. So this is the kind of nuance I'd call between a cult and a team, right? So in both, what do we want? Both a team and a cult. We want people who buy in, right? Who adopt a worldview that is like conducive to whatever we're trying to do, who see the mission as more important than anything else, right? Who are able to kind of put their personal ego aside and say, this is what matters. Now, the difference is, like a team, we kind of, or a workplace or whatever we want to call, we equate to a more positive thing. In a cult, we equate it towards like you've been deluded and brainwashed and what have you. So I think there is a lot of susceptibility to that. And I think the difference is this, is that actual kind of long-lasting team intrinsic motivator, generally, if you can get it, it's like harder to do because it takes actually creating real buy-in and connection through the kind of cult model, or in this case, we'll use the Russian example. It creates delusion, not through creating actual buy-in connection. I'm going to sell you on why this is important, but instead I'm going to constrict the narrative so much that the world you're living in looks so narrow that this is the only thing you can see. So this has to be true. And I think, again, there's lots of problems with that. But one of the main problems in the modern world is that can work really well as long as that worldview is narrowed. But it also allows for that worldview to quickly become popped, and people open up their eyes and they're like, what in the world is going on? And you instantly lose all that motivation behind whatever you were trying to do.
What have you seen with athletes who maybe get caught up in something like that? You're an elite coach of many athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what you see is they start, and specifically is when you get caught up in, we'll just call it that kind of external view and external validation and outcome kind of focus, is I like to compare it between almost like when you're lighting a fire, is the external stuff looks really good at first. It's like pouring lighter fluid on the fire. Big flame, looks great, but it fades very quickly.
Yeah.
And instead what we're looking for is trying to almost use the long-lasting, not very sexy coals that just burn for a really long freaking time. And what you see is if you go too far towards that kind of fancy fire, that extrinsic, what happens is it changes your appreciation and your why for why you're doing the thing. So those outcome accolades, achievements become a bigger and bigger part. And what often happens is that makes us fragile. And the way I describe this is, if you or I signed up, I don't know, for some random race or for some random game and we lost, right? We might feel a little bit bad, but it's not like the end of the world because we'd be like, who cares? Like Steve, Brennan, like, doesn't matter. Like, we're going to have other things that are important to our life where this little loss in this race or game doesn't matter. But if we tie ourselves if we get too stuck on those accolades, achievements, defining our self-worth, then what happens is every game, every presentation, every event, almost our brain interprets it as this kind of life or death, where our self-worth is on the line, where if we don't, nail this pitch in front of this company or, score this goal to win the game, it is literally like the destruction of ourselves. It's like our self-worth goes away. So it makes us incredibly fragile if we become too dependent entirely on kind of this external motivator to keep us going.
So what makes a good athlete who can be coachable and ride through these sort of things?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is with coachability is I call it quieting your ego down. Meaning we all have egos, athletes especially. If you're looking at highly competitive ones, like they're good at what they do, they want to be good. That's great, but we can't have that ego take over. So much so that you start again seeing things kind of through a deluded and selfish standpoint. And I think here, actually, some of the most competitive athletes are great examples of this. The late Kobe Bryant or even Michael Jordan. If you look at Jordan, for example, he's known for his competitiveness. He obviously has an ego. Absolutely. But if you look at when did Jordan win his 6 championships, his first championship was in his 7th year when Phil Jackson took over as his coach. And Phil Jackson is notorious for being known as like the Zen master. And he didn't make Michael Jordan like some Buddhist monk, but just having that influence, what it does is it takes the harsh, maybe we'll call it negative side of maybe a Jordan's competitiveness and an ego, and it brings it back just a little bit, just enough, where Jordan is still has that competitiveness, but now understands how to be focused and present in the moment, how to let go of some of the losses or the missed shots and get back to the game itself. And I think, again, you find this wonderful balance. And I don't think it's a mistake that, Jackson, who also coached Kobe Bryant to his championships, another infamously competitive guy, like there's this kind of, again, not fully over on the full side of this zenned out dude, but it counterbalances enough to almost like allow those athletes to use that competitiveness in the right manner, while still having their kind of like ego checked just a little bit so they could be great teammates and get over the losses and get back to the games and the process that really matters to performing at their best.
Mm-hmm. So if dropping that ego is the thing that makes a coachable athlete, what makes a great coach for that athlete?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is matching up.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is we're all humans. We're all going to have our individual personalities and all that stuff. And a great coach is able to connect and almost like create the fit with that athlete. Mm-hmm. And again, if you look at it, what do great coaches really do is they create that sense of connection. And that connection is authentic, taking it all back to what we talked about at the beginning with Zelensky and Ukraine. Like it can't be fake. Mm-hmm. You can't have the athlete who thinks like, oh, this coach is just using me for championships and doesn't really care about me or my career or what have you. It has to be authentic. And then the other part of I think that what makes a great coach is they get out of their own way, especially at the highest level. Is athletes are good for a reason. And if you micromanage and try and overly control, athletes feel constrained and restricted and don't feel that autonomy. And often that's what creates that discontent, because you're not allowing them to essentially be themselves and utilize their skills to the highest level. So what you often see is, really good coaches are able to essentially tailor their approach to make sure that their coaching is giving people that autonomy, that support, that freedom to utilize their skills, while still, allowing them to be themselves. And I'll give one more example from Phil Jackson. Is he, during one of those Chicago Bulls runs, we had Dennis Rodman on the team. Yeah. Who was like the eccentric on the eccentric. And if you watched the wonderful documentary The Last Dance on Michael Jordan, there was this great part where it talks about it, essentially Jackson allowed Rodman in the middle of the NBA season to fly to Las Vegas and party for a day. Now, most coaches would be like, what? You're an elite team. He's your elite player. Like, he's getting paid millions of dollars. You're going to allow him to go, to Vegas? But Jackson knew, is like, man, if I try and control Rodman and just like control all the time, like that's going to blow up in my face. So eventually, sometimes I got to let him in the right moments just go be Dennis Rodman. Mm-hmm. Because in the right moments, maybe during the championship run, like I need him to be locked in. And mm-hmm. Rodman's not going to be locked in for the whole season at all times. So like choose your parts of control very wisely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for anybody who's interested in this story too, I'd read about something similar in one of Phil Jackson's books called 11 Rings. It's a fantastic read.
Yeah, absolutely. A fantastic read. I'd suggest listeners to go check it out.
Mm-hmm. So on this autonomy, this seems to be something that I've heard you speak about in other interviews too. What specifically can coaches do to make sure that they're cultivating that autonomy? Because it seems that it would go against most instincts to rein the players in, control them, and kind of get them where you want them to go.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think that's, one of the reasons it kind of goes against that, or our natural inclination is to go against that, is because the cheap and easy route, the simplest route is just, hey, I'm the coach, do what I say. Mm-hmm. Sure. So you don't have to think about anything. You don't have to get buy-in. You don't have to cultivate some sort of team. You just have to say, I'm the coach, like do what I say. So I think one of the reasons we default to that is because it's easy. So instead, what I challenge coaches or leaders of anywhere is to take the more difficult path, which is try to create space for people to be themselves. And I think when you look at autonomy, the most important thing is that people feel like they have some sort of choice. So we often get autonomy wrong, and we think like, oh, it means freedom, right? You're free to do whatever. And it's like, no, that's not the case. Autonomy is feeling like you have a choice so that you're not stuck and constrained, right? So you can still have a responsibility to show up, to go to practice, all that stuff. But within that, within these bounds or constraints, you have some freedom to do what you need to do. So a lot of it is cultivating that environment. So some of the things that I like to say for coaches is like set the boundaries and constraints. And then within that, let them go. So what I mean by that is, we'll use a workplace example, is give your employees the instructions and the parameters around, hey, we're giving a pitch or a presentation to this company. This is kind of how I want you to work on it. But then don't micromanage and say, hey, you're free to, figure this out however you want. Like, come back to me when you got your ideas coalesced. You're giving them freedom within that constraint of this is what I want to do. Other examples often are when we look at failure. Often the points when we kind of restrict and control the most are when people fail or mess up or what have you. Because as leaders or coaches, we think like, oh gosh, they blew it, so I need to jump in and like control this situation. But whenever you do that, what you then create is almost this fear of, oh gosh, my boss, my coach is going to jump in if I mess up. So that the employee, the athlete, kind of adopts this fear of failure mindset. Instead, what you want to do is on small things where failure is maybe tolerable, let's say an early season game or, in the workplace, like some minor project where it's like, yeah, you want it to work. You have a longer leash. You allow them to try things, to take risks and maybe fail and learn from it and grow, and not just kind of go down there, straight into control mode because they messed up. And what that allows you to do is develop that capacity and mental muscle for them, where it's like, oh, it's okay to take chances. It's okay to explore. It's okay to, see if something might or might not work in these small environments, which then pushes them and gives them the motivation to kind of have that freedom to take risks when it actually matters over the long haul.
Mm-hmm. So this sounds great, Steve. Like I think as an athlete, I would want to be coached in a way that would give me a lot of autonomy, or as an employee. Then I think of exceptions, and I wonder what made things work so well for Tiger Woods for so long. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so a couple different things is I think there's exceptions to every rule, and when we talk about these things, we talk on average and bulk.
Okay.
And what I would say here is, again, you look at Tiger Woods, great example. I would venture to say 99.9% of people, if they were put in Tiger Woods' situation, especially as a young kid and like just being singularly focused, they probably would have burned out. Or like hated golf after a while, because like what kid wants to be kind of quote unquote forced by their parent to play the same thing over and over again? For most it backfires, but for whatever reason, like Woods has this talent and maybe this internal fortitude that is just otherworldly. And the example I'll give you as a runner, and this might not be familiar for all of your audience, but I'll try and explain, is back in the 1960s, there was a phenomenal athlete named Jim Ryan. And he was the first high school guy to run under 4 minutes in the mile. And if you look back and you look at Jim Ryan's training in high school, it is the craziest stuff I've ever seen. Like, for non-runners, it is like he is running so many miles and he is working out hard every day. And if I gave that to a high school kid today, what he did, I would probably get like sued for neglect and punishment. But it worked. Jim Ryan was a high school phenom who went on to literally hold the world record in the mile. Mm-hmm. Now, does that mean that we should all copy Jim Ryan? No, it's the sense is that Jim Ryan is the exception, and he could get away with that and do crazy things because he was otherworldly talented. and not to take away from any of his coaches at that time, but you could have given Jim Ryan, like, some random grandma off the street to coach him, and he probably would have been pretty dang good.
Sure.
And I think that's where we often kind of make the mistake, is we see some of these exceptions and we say, oh, Tiger Woods or like Serena Williams, like this is the way that we have to do it. And if you're otherworldly talented, maybe you'll get away with it. Maybe it'll work. But unfortunately, like most of us aren't otherworldly talented. So those small things are going to make a bigger difference and maybe push us or pull us towards success or failure in a bigger way.
Mm-hmm. So we're comparing to historical examples. I wonder, what do you see ahead for sport, especially as there's new technologies that could be pushing things, genetics, PEDs. What do you see sport evolving into while still recognizing these human dilemmas?
Yeah, it's interesting. I could see it going a number of different ways. I think it's tough to say, and I think it really depends on society's preferences, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
So if we see sport as something that is about, I don't know, something more than winning and losing and competition, and something that is about fairness or what have you, then there's going to be we're going to face an interesting spot coming up where maybe we have the ability to genetically modify someone's, ability so they have more endurance or strength or speed or what have you. Or we have an increase in performance enhancing drugs that maybe even some that might be safe. And we have to ask the question of, well, do we want to see people perform to the nth degree with this? Or do we want to see what people quote unquote naturally can do on a relatively level playing field? Level meaning it's like the genetic chance that you got. And I think that's going to depend entirely on society and what we value. And I could see it going either way, because, there's part of society that I think will say, like, forget it. Let's see how fast people can run and how much they can lift and how crazy football will be if we just modify everything. And there's other people who say, like, well, that creates some inequality, and maybe if you don't have that opportunity or what have you. So I think it's going to be an interesting, I don't know when in the future, but at some point we're going to have to say, essentially, it almost comes down to this. Do we see sport entirely as entertainment, or do we see sport as like some sort of competition and like inner worth that is tied into it? And where we put our finger on the thumb is going to decide kind of what way we go in sport and culture.
Yeah. How do you see that debate? You've lived a life of so much sport.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I'm kind of more, I'd say like a naturalist purist, in the sense that I love sport because I think it is the perfect metaphor for so many things in life. Meaning you got what you got, and you can't control what other people do, but you can control how much work you put into it and how close to your own maximum ability you can get. And there's something just like wonderful about like seeing where your limit lies. And I think with artificially shifting that limit in a number of different ways, that kind of takes away from that purity to it for me. But I could also see something where you could make that argument and say, okay, well, we want sport pure, or for those, like, we'll say it, non-entertainment values through youth sports and high school and maybe even college. But at the top of the top, we just want to see crazy stuff. And I could see that delineation come, and I'm not sure where I stand on it, but I could understand that delineation where you say, hey, once you're whatever 26 and you're just trying to do crazy stuff in your sport, then maybe that's a legitimate answer. So I think there is some nuance in there.
Mm-hmm. And you are someone who had a lot of talent and came on very young. What was it like coming up as an elite long distance runner and being the fastest high school boy in America and progressing through that?
Yeah, so it was interesting because it was at the beginning, what I'd call the beginning of the like real internet stage, where you start understanding and saying like, oh, like I get some notoriety out of this, and I get some quote unquote fame and what have you. Um, so in a lot of ways, it was like really, I mean, it was exciting and wonderful and all that stuff, but it also made me very clear, I think, on getting too tied up into that stuff, because you can quickly lose kind of your sense of self and your identity and tie it too much into the thing and the notoriety and the quote unquote like fame. And
Mm-hmm.
in this sense, we're just talking about a very niche field, right?
Right.
We're talking about running. Like no one really cares about running. But I think we all have these niches where it's like you get known as something, maybe a podcaster in the health field, or like, the best, Madden video game player. Like there's so many niches right now. So I think that's where this kind of fame or notoriety like almost is amplified. Is in the past it meant you're a movie star or what have you, but now you can be known in your small niche. And I think, again, growing up kind of in that era and like experiencing that to a small degree really forced me and pushed me to say, okay, what actually matters? Like, what do I want to be about? And to kind of struggle with that to figure that out. And I certainly did, in my early, career as a runner, is like figuring out, okay, especially as I didn't improve and didn't meet my own expectations as goals, is like, okay, how do I, what does running mean to me, and what do I actually want to do? Am I okay kind of letting go of this and all that good stuff?
What was that like when you felt like you weren't hitting your own targets or making the kind of improvement you expected? Were there different triggers that you were trying to pull to move through that? Maybe some of the ones that we've talked about that do work or don't work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's difficult because I think here's what people, especially when you're good at something young, is the way I like to describe it is, um, most kids when they were like, you're in high school, you're exploring things,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're maybe trying the track team, the football team, the chess club, whatever it is, like drama. There's so many different things. And most kids in high school are trying to figure out, hey, what am I good at? What do I want to do at the next level, et cetera. Well, because I was really good at running, like I didn't explore. I just said, oh, I'm good at running. Like this is what I'm going to do. And you become almost very narrow and cemented around that. And what I think that does is when that path towards progress or future starts to close, like in my eyes, I said, oh, I'm going to be good at running. I'm going to go to college and run. I'm going to go to the Olympics, run professionally. And once those doors close, you didn't have those backups or that exploration phase where you're just like, oh, well, what else am I interested in? What else am I good at? And it kind of forces you to go through this almost like identity crisis where you're just like, okay, how do I figure this out? And that was really, really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It was really difficult in
Mm-hmm.
that moment. And I think that's what it actually gets back to maybe some of the things I talked about in my book, Do Hard Things, which is like, okay, the easy thing is to just like put your head down and say like, oh, I'm a runner and I'm going to do this. The hard thing is to zoom out, create some perspective, and essentially say, okay, this path didn't work. My world isn't over. Like my identity isn't just in running. Where do I want to go next, and what actually matters to me? And I think that was it was again a process, but perspective and zooming out was one of the biggest things. And I'll tell you, one of the best things that helped me in that moment was actually stepping back and volunteering and helping, like volunteer. In this case, like I just started volunteer helping out these high school kids who had no coach at that point. And I was just, finish up my college career, and I'm just like, you're at the same park as me. I'll tell you everything I need to know about running. Here you go. I wasn't getting paid for it, whatever, but it kind of brought this perspective and kind of brought me back to, oh, well, I didn't get into running because of like running some certain time or fame or like notoriety or making this big goal that I have. I got into it just because it was a good time with some good friends and allowed me to push myself and see what I was capable of in this specific avenue. And what that teaches you is, we'll get back to those things, is running is just a venue. what other avenues do I want to explore and find some joy and motivation in kind of like pushing myself in and exploring what I'm capable of.
Mm-hmm. So after doing the volunteer coaching, what was next? You've come such a long way now to be an author and journalism and coaching and everything.
Yeah. So initially what happened is I just went straight down the rabbit hole of like, well, first I got my master's in sports science and went down the rabbit hole of kind of understanding the science of it and the psychology of it. And then I got into coaching. I spent 2 years or a little less than 2 years at Nike doing it, ended horribly, got into college coaching, loved it. But it's kind of similar to my own running career is I love coaching runners, but I'm a big what I learned from my running career is like I want to chase interesting things and do interesting things and kind of be motivated to kind of explore and always challenge myself. Well, after some bit, like just staying narrowly in the kind of running coaching world was not as challenging to me. So it pushed me to branch out and write and explore some of these performance aspects outside of the world of running and even outside of the world of sport and see like, performance is performance. How do we help people no matter what their avenue or process or pursuit is?
Yeah. So in the workplace now, it seems the modern knowledge work environment is often very unproductive. There seems to be a lot of email checking and things like that and meetings. What are you seeing that people can be tapping into to get that sort of athletic type focus or more consistent and effective results in the workplace?
Yeah, number one is you have to be intentional. So I think if you look at athletes, what do they do really well? Is they show up to practice and there is a point of practice and an organization to practice to develop some sort of skill that translates to, for them, their game. I think the same thing applies towards our workplace. What often happens is that we default towards feeling productive instead of being productive. Mm. So that means what we do is we do simple things like checking and responding to email because it feels like we're getting something done. Mm-hmm. Instead of doing the actual maybe hard work that matters, like, whatever the deep work is. And what happens is we get fatigued from checking email. So by the time we get to the deep work, it's like doing a workout and then saying, okay, now I'm gonna do the hard stuff. And you're like, oh, I'm tired already from the workout, so I can't do the hard stuff. So I think in our workplace, we're just kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. So instead, what I'd say is like be very intentional on how you schedule things. So for example, I'll give you in my writing career is that's got to be deep, focused, kind of creative work. So I always try to do that when my mind is sharpest and most freshest. Mm-hmm. And for me, that happens to be in the morning. Mm-hmm. So after I kind of go through a kind of brief morning routine with exercise and eating, whatever have you, then it's like get down to the writing, the focus work. In the afternoon is where I try and do, I'll call it my non kind of deep focus work, which could be something like recording this podcast with you. It could be, looking back and transferring notes from research into some sort of systematic, file where, yeah, I have to think, but it's not like tapping into that deep work. And often emails are the last things that I do in the day. And I just try and batch process them, which is like once a day is like, okay, it's email time. Like this sucks, but I'm going to have to do it. So let's get it done.
Yeah. And with the new book, Do Hard Things, what would you say is the message you're trying to get across with that book?
Yeah, I think it comes back to some of the things we talked about at the beginning, which is to kind of, the way I would say is we've often thought about toughness or resilience or grit in a single-minded approach, which is essentially put your head down, grit your teeth, push through things. It's almost like telling people, here's a hammer. And a hammer works really well. Like it can work well for the specific situation. So I'm not saying don't push through things, don't put your head down, but I'm saying do that when there is a nail in front of you. But we also are going to encounter so many different situations that are tough, difficult, where instead of the hammer, we're going to need a wrench or a screwdriver or a saw or whatever have you. And to me, creating toughness that actually works is developing those other tools, which could be something as simple as, instead of pushing, like learn how to step back and let go or create that perspective. Or it could be learn how to use mindfulness to create some sort of resilience as you detach from your kind of thoughts, emotions, and experience. And I'm saying none of these tactics or techniques or tools are cure-alls, but if we have a wider tool set, then it's more likely to say, okay, when we approach that really difficult thing, then I'm going to have some sort of tool to pull out where I said, okay, this might actually help me work. And if it doesn't, I can say, okay, forget the hammer. Like, let me try this thing over here. And we're more likely to be successful that way.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of some of these figures who seem to push the hammer every time? I'm thinking Jocko, I'm thinking David Goggins. What is in that, or what do you notice?
Yeah, so I think, those guys have done amazing things, and I'm never going to put those guys down. Their work is invaluable as well. But I think what it does is it gives a narrow scope of skill sets to be tough. And here I'll give an example. Again, I'm not trying to put anyone down, but what Goggins has done is amazing. But often what he's doing is, for example, I forget the exact story, but he ran through like an ultra marathon on like a broken bone or something like that. That's great. But that is part of toughness in terms of like tolerance to pain and suffering. Now I want you to compare that to, let's say, an elite marathoner. Would I want them to run through a broken bone in the marathon? No, because it probably ruins like at least 6 to 9 months of their next career. I would want them to stop suffering at that first hint. So maybe instead of a broken bone fully, it's just a small little fracture that might heal in 6 to 8 weeks. Mm-hmm. So the difference in that is saying, okay, performance really matters. And it's not just suffering or tolerance of pain. And I need to be able to distinguish this pain to understand, is this going to push me down along a bad path or a good one? Another example I'll give, and this is actually some fascinating research that they looked at evaluating disasters on Mount Everest. Whenever a disaster has struck and a lot of people have died while climbing, some researchers found that one of the central things that contributes to that is that people get a blindness towards the goal, which is getting to the top. And they get so focused on getting to the top that they stop sensing and perceiving maybe the signs of danger around them, because tolerating the pain, discomfort for the end goal is the most important thing. And what the research says is it minimizes or it restricts their ability to detach from that goal when there is a better goal present. So in terms of climbing, maybe the thing is, I'm going to detach from my goal of making it to the top because the weather is horrible. I don't have enough food to make it to the top and all the way back down. And I'm shifting my goal to getting down to the mountain and keeping myself and the rest of the people in my party alive. And I think that's kind of where we get this kind of Goggins or Jocko or what have you, is that I get it. We need to tell people to do difficult things, do hard things, like to, learn how to suffer and tolerate. But we can't go too far in that extreme, because if we do, we lose this perspective and we lose some of these other tools where sometimes the right answer and the tough question is to quit. Sometimes the tough answer is to call it a day and say, I want to survive instead of die, or I want to stop so I don't break something, because this allows me to get back to the things that actually matter, which is performing in this race or game or what have you, quicker than if I just kind of put my head down and push through everything.
Yeah. So Steve, you have left the University of Houston to take on a new phase in your career. What has it been like leaving a place where you've been for a long time? It's your alma mater. What are you doing? What drove that decision?
Yeah, it was tough, because it is like, again, it's part of who you are. I graduated from there. I knew all the coaches, all the athletes, all that good stuff. So it does feel like you're leaving a part of you behind in some sense. But I think that's true for any change. And as I've talked about, throughout this podcast, I think growth and development and challenging myself in those ways is a central component or value that I hold kind of dear and true. And it just got to the point where I was juggling a billion different things in terms of consulting, writing, podcasting, newsletters, coaching, all of that stuff. And I was wearing myself so thin that I couldn't give my all or give the level of commitment and effort that I wanted to. And coaching collegiately is an all-in job. Like you're devoted to it, and you're rightfully so devoted to those athletes. And I felt like, well, something had to give. And I didn't want to do something that I was half-assing it, right? So that it just kind of came to the natural point of my life where I said, okay, I've got all these other things and interests that I'm really fortunate to be in a position to explore. So I'm gonna kind of step away from this kind of phase of my life and explore those. And again, it was tough. I mean, the hardest thing I think is like the bonds and relationships you form and those things, and kind of stepping away from those, and the uncertainty of new ventures. But it's the only way we can continue to grow. So, a little risk is unnerving and stressful, but it also is a place for adaptation and growth.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think people can pick those priorities and know what to aim for, or how many things to narrow it down? Like when you work with a client, maybe how do you help folks with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think number one is defining what is important to you. Mm-hmm. And I think the key here is we talk about values and all that stuff a lot, but like to me, its values aren't slogans. They're what really matter to you in this moment. Mm-hmm. And, what are those things that bring that kind of joy and motivation to your life and kind of fill it up? And the other thing that I really try and stress with people is those can change over time. And I like to see our lives as almost like seasons, in the sense that the things that we valued as maybe a 20-something-year-old are going to be different than the 40-something-year-old. I was working with a client the other day who's very successful, but in his 50s. And he said, like this specific kind of work that I've done all my life that used to get me jazzed up, like now I have a quote unquote big win and I'm just like, what's the point? And I was like, that's fine. Like, this is a different season of your life. What gets you jazzed up? And he was like, well, it's mentoring people. It's like passing these lessons down. And I'm saying, okay, well, what do you take from that is you say, okay, maybe I don't give up this whole thing over here, but I shift some more of my time and prioritization to this mentoring or this aspect that seems really valuable in my space. And I think having some sort of reflective process, whether that's talking to someone else, whether that's some sort of journaling, whether that's some sort of, again, just kind of mental reflection process that occurs semi-regularly, that allows us to say, okay, are the things that I'm doing still aligned with the things that matter and give me value and purpose in life? And if not, how am I going to realign those or work towards that realignment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what of those reflective processes do you use?
So I'm a big journaler. So I've got journals all over the place. Here's one right next to me, for all sorts of stuff. And what I try and do is, again, split my life into kind of seasons where I try and use the big landmarks as kind of reflective pieces. So for instance, after a book comes out, I create some space, some time off, and I'm just like, okay, like that was great. What did I take away from that? What do I learn? Where do I want to go next? Is there another idea I want to explore? And then the other part of that process too is I have literally an ideas notebook where it's just like a running list of, random things that are like, oh, that's kind of interesting to me. And I'll just jot it down. And what I inevitably find is that I try and almost be like, hopefully this analogy works. I try and be like a kindergartner, where if you remember back to like elementary school, is like 1 week, your teacher reads a book about a fireman, and for the next week or two, you're obsessed with like firemen. And you're just like, I want to be a fireman. And then inevitably that fades and something else goes. Well, I want to have a little bit, not all that way, but a little bit of that kindergartner in me where it's like, oh, this is really interesting. Let's explore it. And sometimes that exploration goes away after a week or two, but sometimes that exploration turns into a book or some other idea where it's like it captures me for not just a week or two, but months or years on end where I want to explore. And I just want to give myself that kind of reflective space where I get to, kind of figure that out instead of just saying, okay, what's next? Dive into it. What's next? Dive into it.
Yeah. What on that list is popping for you right now?
Oh man, that's a really good question. So, right now, honestly, I'm really circling, and it probably shows from this conversation we've had, is like that identity piece and how that shifts and changes over our careers or lifetimes and what that means. And honestly, right now I'm trying to just into the exploration phase of saying like, well, if you look at, there's some wonderful pieces in Western psychology and culture, we can look at identity, but there's also different views of, Eastern Buddhist or non-attachment or non-selves, and the self is illusion. And I think it's just like an interesting place where I have no answers, but it's something that I'm like, well, let's explore this and maybe something will come out of it. And if not, that's okay. Like I learned something new and that's good enough for me.
Yeah. Well, when you come out with that one, I'd like to read it. That's something that I question a lot. A lot of my friends who are veterans too, as we transition out of the military, and it's the military, much like college sports, is a whole lifestyle. So making these changes and then letting that old identity fade and building a new one is a huge challenge. Is there anything so far that you're seeing that seems meaty, seems worth considering?
Yeah, on that topic right there, I'm glad you brought it up. There was a wonderful research paper that was, I think, partially titled "Athletes Die Twice," which is, once in real life, whenever their life is done, but also after their career is done. And I think that applies to the military as well, is like you wrap everything around this thing. The culture is very kind of specific and you get used to it. It comes natural, and then you get thrown into the quote unquote real world, rest of the world, and it's like, wait a minute, like we don't have these clear objectives and these clear measurements or these clear roles, and it's just kind of a mess, and people really struggle with it. I mean, there's again in that research that shows that that it's almost like for many it feels like a significant loss or a significant bout of depression or whatever other mental health issue you want to cause. So I think there's something to figuring out a better way to help people transition and give them the not only real maybe skills, but also how to, I'll give you a sneak peek of some research is that a lot of it shows that role clarity is really important. And one of the problems is we have all these skills, whether we're talking sport or military, that clearly translate to other things, but we're so kind of attached and narrow to applying them in this narrow space that we often don't realize how we can take those same skills and apply it in this other area. So a lot of it isn't, hey, we got to teach these people how to, here's some skills. A lot of it is saying you already got the skills, but we need to open up your mind almost for like seeing how these apply to these different roles so that you can apply them in those ways. And it's almost, again, creating this, new sense of self or role around something else that you do so you can apply the skills, tools, and tactics that you already know.
Yeah, it reminds me of a line from Once a Runner. Have you read that book?
Yes.
It's something along the lines of the golf locker room is the methadone clinic for ex-jocks. That there's this need for something that feels similarly focused. So even if you're a hobby golfer, it feels similarly focused to playing a sport. What do you think are other things that maybe people could kind of pull on to get some of that feeling, as they're transitioning out of a sport or something like that?
Yeah. So what I would say there's this wonderful research by neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky, who essentially said, we all need status, but the wonderful thing is we can get status anywhere. And he gives this example and talks about the biology of like when we have status, we get these bumps in testosterone and we feel good and confident and all that stuff. But he uses this wonderful example where he says, that status, we often think it has to come from the workplace or what have you. But from the health and psychology research, if you got that status from being the best softball player on the company softball team, you'll still be healthy and have all these spaces. So I think about that a lot in terms of military sport, et cetera, as we have this natural ability to kind of get role clarity and status because we're the athlete, we're the soldier, we're the guy in the special forces, whatever. It's like we know where we stand, we know what's important, we know what we're doing provides value in some way. And often we get out in the world and it doesn't come as clear as that. So to me, as if you're transitioning, one of the things that I want you to think about is, well, where am I going to get that sense of status? And not think of status as a negative thing, but just something where it's like, hey, I'm good at this. Hey, I feel valuable and contributing in this. And too often we only look for it in the workplace, but it can come from all sorts of other different avenues and places. So like find that niche where it's like, hey, I'm good in this area. I'm known in this area. Like feels good to be wanted in this area and really kind of cultivate that.
Mm-hmm. Steve, we've talked about a lot of things that I think suggest temperance and balance. And I do wonder what you think of maybe hacks to sort of force yourself to another level of performance. I'm thinking particularly of some we used to talk about as like a death ground, whereas your back is to the wall. The only solution is to rise. I have a quote from Sun Tzu on this one. So when warriors are in great danger, then they have no fear. When there is nowhere to go, they are firm. When they are deeply involved, they stick to it. If they have no choice, they will fight. Do you think there is a place for this sort of back to the wall situation?
I do. As I said, I think there's nuance here. It's kind of like the burn the boats idea behind you. What I would say is it depends on the individual and where they're at. So there's two things. I'm not going to argue with Sun Tzu, but what I would say is that there are two responses that generally happen. Is if you burn the boats, someone either says like, well, I'm free to perform now because it doesn't matter. I just got to approach and go for it. The other response is almost the opposite, where it's like the fear threat response, where it's like, oh my gosh, I have no out. I have no options. And I'll use the example. It's almost like the athlete who chokes, right? It's like they stop being able to perform and do the thing that comes naturally because their brain almost freaks out and says like, do a freeze response, just fall to the ground and like, protect yourself and hope that you don't get damaged, right? Or hope that you don't get killed. So, that's how I kind of see those two spots going. And to me, it's all about kind of timing and knowing who you're working with and knowing who you are, where it's like, if you think you're going to be that challenge person, then at the right time, in the right moment, burn the boats. If you think this is going to push you to play out of a place of extreme fear, or you think this is going to push those you lead out of extreme fear, then don't burn the boats, man. Give them an out, right? Mm-hmm. Because sometimes it's like, I'll use the athletic example. And sometimes people have their best performances when it's do or die. And sometimes people have their best performances maybe right after their kind of worst performance ever. And they think like, well, it can't get any worse. So like, what's the point? And they feel free to perform. So it literally is kind of that individualized matching it up where you think you are the person you are leading is at that moment.
Yeah. Steve, you have a very special skill for looking at different sides of these questions. For people who want to see more of what you're up to and what you're thinking about this, where should they look for you online?
Yeah, so you can find me on all social media at Steve Magness. You can check out my webpage, stevemagness.com. We got a great newsletter and podcast through the company I work with called The Growth Equation. You can check that out. And, my book, Do Hard Things, and other ones are sold wherever books are sold. So I appreciate you listeners checking that out.
Cool. We'll put links to all that in the description for everybody who wants to check that out. And Steve, my final question is, what do you think leaders can do to cultivate toughness in their teams?
So I think the biggest thing you can do is create an environment that allows people to take risks, potentially fail, and get back up again and try again.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you cultivate that environment, then you're going to allow people to essentially get out of their own way and free them up to perform.
Mm-hmm.
I think too often leaders, we micromanage, we overly control, try to step back, not on everything, but let go on the things that really don't matter and allow people to kind of flourish, especially your performers who have demonstrated that, like, hey, they're high performers, they're going to get stuff done. The way I kind of look at it is you as the leader decide how long and short the leash is, and your goal is gradually over time to lengthen that leash, so that your best performers, like, man, they got a long leash, because yeah, they might mess up sometimes, but like they have the ability, and you got to set them free so that they can utilize it.
Yeah, that's great. Steve, thank you so much for being so generous to spend this time with me. I really appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was a wonderful conversation. Appreciate what you're doing.